This is a counterfactual history hypothesis, entirely fictional, not a real historical event. What if the day Christopher Columbus set foot on the New World was not the day that opened an age of discovery, but the day humanity first came face to face with the true rulers of this planet, creatures that should have vanished 66 million years earlier? Before we begin, a quick note. This is a counterfactual history hypothesis, entirely fictional, created for us to reflect on together, not a real historical event. Imagine a different timeline, a timeline where the Chicxulub asteroid, for some reason, veered off course by a few degrees, or struck with a fraction less force than the history we know. The dust and ash weren't thick enough to plunge the atmosphere into eternal darkness. Sunlight still filtered through the clouds, plants still photosynthesized, and on one isolated continent, the one humans would later call America, the dinosaurs never went extinct. They evolved, they adapted, they grew stronger in history's shadow, waiting for tens of millions of years, until the fateful morning of October 12, 1492. This is the story of what might have happened if Columbus's 3 small ships had not landed on a shore of peaceful native tribes, but on the last kingdom of the dinosaurs. Part 1. Dawn of Disaster. Picture the scene. After more than 2 months adrift on the ocean, enduring thirst, the near mutinous grumbling of the crew, and a doubt that gnawed endlessly at himself, Christopher Columbus finally saw what he had long hoped for. A faint green streak on the horizon. Land. The New World. That night, on the deck of the Santa Maria, no one slept. Men cheered. Men prayed. Men wept in each other's arms with relief. To them, this was the reward for a journey that had seemed hopeless. Proof that the earth was round. A new Silk Road leading to the gold and spices of the East. None of them could have imagined what awaited them in the dense forests ahead. The next morning, as the sun turned the Caribbean waters gold, Columbus sent a small scouting party rowing toward shore. It was a familiar ritual for expeditions of the time. Plant a flag, claim sovereignty in the name of Spain, look for signs of people and riches. The scouting party numbered around 15 men, armed with arquebuses and Toledo steel swords, the sharpest, most reliable weapons in Europe at the time, along with the absolute confidence of men who believed they were bringing the light of civilization to a wild, untamed land. They stepped onto the white sand. The air was humid and heavy with the smell of tropical vegetation. In the distance, beyond the tree line, came a strange sound, a low, rolling rumble, like thunder that never quite finished, echoing from the chest of some enormous creature. The soldiers, accustomed to the roar of sea lions or the howl of wolves back home, had no concept of such a sound. They simply assumed it was the wind, or perhaps some large beast they had never seen before, a wild ox, an elephant, something of that scale. They pressed deeper into the forest, and then, through the thick canopy, they saw it. A creature taller than any animal they had ever known, its head crowned with 3 sharp horns and a massive bony frill wrapped around its neck like a living shield. Triceratops. It grazed placidly, paying no mind to the small visitors who had just appeared. But that calm did not last, because somewhere in the underbrush, another threat was lying in wait, and the sound of the men had woken it. From the shadows of the forest, a pack of smaller but terrifyingly quick creatures burst forth, crescent-shaped claws, eyes sharp as blades, and a speed no European horse could match. Deinonychus. They hunted in packs, coordinating with a crude but ruthless intelligence, like wolves carrying the savagery of reptiles within them. The scouting party's captain, on the instinct of a battle-hardened soldier, screamed the order to fire. The arquebuses cracked loudly, gun smoke billowing into the humid air. but the crude lead balls, which had once brought down countless Moorish cavalrymen in the wars of the Iberian Peninsula, now merely lodged in hide as thick as armor plating, causing no meaningful harm. The Toledo steel blades, which had once cleaved through armor itself, proved useless against the speed and ferocity of the Deinonychus pack. In under 5 minutes, the scouting party fell apart. Screaming, splintering trees, the clash of metal all blurred into a horrifying chaos. A few lucky men made it back to the beach, hurling themselves into the water, swimming frantically toward the small boats waiting offshore. The rest never returned. Columbus, standing on the deck of the Santa Maria, watched the scene unfold from a distance through a crude spyglass. He could not believe what his eyes were showing him. In his ship's log, which, if this timeline had truly existed, would go on to become one of the most contested documents ever written, he set down trembling lines about giant land dragons, about a cursed land, about how the New World was not a gift from God, but perhaps a punishment. He ordered an immediate withdrawal. The 3 ships weighed anchor in the dark of night, leaving behind a blood-stained shore and stories that would haunt Europe for centuries to come. Part 2. Europe in Panic. When Columbus returned to Spain early the following year, he brought no gold, no spices, no native slaves or exotic treasures as everyone had expected. He brought back half his original crew, faces hollow with fear, and a story that no one, not even the most powerful kings in Europe, could fully believe. Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, who had poured a fortune into funding the voyage, listened with expressions caught between astonishment and disbelief. A new land, yes, but a land guarded by monsters capable of tearing an entire company of soldiers apart. It sounded like nothing more than a fairy tale, or worse, the excuse of a failure. But then the surviving sailors began telling their own accounts, independently of one another, and the details lined up with unsettling precision. The Catholic Church, which had watched this voyage closely in hopes of extending the faith to new lands, now found itself in an unprecedented theological crisis. The Bible made no mention of such creatures. The book of Genesis described God creating every beast of the land, the sea, and the sky, but there was no place in it for 2-legged dragons taller than a house. Scholars at Salamanca, the most learned theologians of the age, argued fiercely. Some claimed this was proof of the devil's existence, that the New World was where Satan had hidden after his expulsion from heaven, and that these creatures were his servants. Others, more cautious, suggested these might simply be beasts the Bible had never recorded, a gap in human knowledge that God, for reasons of his own, had chosen to keep hidden. Whichever interpretation one accepted, the outcome was the same. In the eyes of 15th century Europe, America became a cursed land. People called it by fearful names: the Devil's Domain, the Western Hell, the Land God Forgot. Nautical charts began marking the Caribbean waters with drawings of monsters and Latin warnings, echoing older maps that once bore the phrase, "Hic sunt dracones," here be dragons. The economic and political consequences ran deeper still. The entire colonial project that Spain, and soon Portugal, England, and France had dreamed of, the mining of gold and silver, the founding of plantations, the transatlantic slave trade, collapsed before it ever truly began. No explorer dared risk his life to repeat the mistake of that first scouting party. Hernán Cortés, who in the true history conquered the Aztec Empire with only a few hundred soldiers, thanks to steel weapons, war horses, and disease, became instead, in this alternate history, a name tied to catastrophic failure rather than glory. Had he ever tried to lead an army into the continent, his conquering force would have faced an enemy that could not be negotiated with, could not be deceived, and had no political weakness to exploit, only raw muscle and the pure survival instinct of giant reptiles, that had ruled the earth for hundreds of millions of years before humans ever existed. Even at sea, the danger did not ease. Sailors began telling tales of enormous creatures lurking beneath the Atlantic waters, sea monsters with teeth like swords, capable of capsizing a wooden sailing ship with a single strike. Mosasaurus, the giant marine reptile that once ruled the prehistoric oceans, was said to still lurk in unexplored deep waters, turning the transatlantic shipping route from a promising trade corridor into a potential graveyard for any vessel bold enough to attempt the crossing. For decades afterward, America nearly vanished from Europe's map of ambition. It lived on in ghost stories told around the hearth, in best-selling books that blended fact and fantasy, but no king dared invest his nation's treasury in an expedition that might end in catastrophe. Part 3. 200 Years of Waiting. But history, in any timeline, rarely stands still forever. While America slept behind its veil of fear and legend, Europe kept moving forward. Only now, its path of progress carried a different character than the one we know. With no vast flow of gold and silver arriving from the New World, European empires were forced to seek prosperity by other means. Trade with the East became more important than ever. Maritime powers invested more heavily in shipbuilding, in navigational science, in weapons improvement, not to easily conquer new lands, but driven by a quiet, persistent obsession, how, someday, humanity might return and confront the creatures that had once defeated them. It took 2, even 3 centuries until the Industrial Revolution began reshaping the world, before humans finally possessed tools capable of seriously challenging the dinosaurs' dominance over America. Gunpowder was refined to strike with many times the force of Columbus-era arquebuses. Heavy cannons, cast from iron and bronze with far greater precision, could fire rounds powerful enough to pierce even the thickest hide of the largest creatures. Armored warships, powered by early steam engines, no longer depended entirely on the wind and could carry far more firepower than the fragile wooden sailing vessels of the 15th century. When new expeditions, armed to the teeth, finally dared to set foot again on that forgotten land, they discovered something astonishing. America had become a world entirely apart, a colossal time capsule where evolution had followed a completely different path from the rest of the planet for tens of millions of years. This was no longer a land that could be easily exploited the way the early colonists had once dreamed. There were no endless fields of sugarcane, no silver mines worked by millions of forced native laborers, no vast cotton plantations feeding the transatlantic slave economy. Instead, America became something closer to a colossal and supremely dangerous nature reserve, a place where every step forward for humanity had to be paid for in blood, sweat, and ceaseless technological innovation. Perhaps it was precisely because of this delay that humanity's natural sciences developed along an entirely different trajectory. Having to confront and try to explain the existence of these giant creatures, beings absent from any religious or classical philosophical text, forced European naturalists to ask questions about the origins of life far more urgently than they did in actual history. Theories of species transformation, of geology, of the true age of the Earth, might have emerged centuries earlier than the moment Charles Darwin published his theory of evolution in the history we know. Paleontology, instead of confining itself to the study of silent fossilized bones, could now directly observe, though at an enormous cost, living creatures that had once existed only in imagination. The colonization of America, if it happened at all in this timeline, would be far slower, far more costly, and of an entirely different character. Instead of small but brutal conquering armies sweeping through native empires, humans would have to advance one step at a time, building fortified strongholds and tightly guarded settlements that resembled military outposts more than ordinary colonial towns. Every inch of land wrested from the wilderness would be the result of an actual battle, not merely a victory parade. Part 4. Native Peoples and a Different Fate. There is one aspect of this hypothesis worth pausing on a little longer: the fate of the peoples who had lived in America for tens of thousands of years before Columbus ever arrived. In actual history, the encounter between Europe and America led to one of the greatest tragedies ever recorded. Tens of millions of native people died from disease, warfare, forced labor, and systematic genocide in the centuries following the Europeans' arrival. Brilliant civilizations like the Aztec, the Inca, and the Maya were nearly wiped out entirely. It stands as one of the darkest chapters in human history. But in this hypothetical timeline, if America truly were a land dominated by creatures dangerous enough to make even Europe's mightiest empires hesitate for 200 or 300 years, would native peoples have suffered the same tragic fate? This is a complicated question, and the answer is probably not simple in either direction. On one hand, a delay in colonization could have given native civilizations centuries more to develop independently, to preserve their culture, language, religion, and social structures without disruption from outside invasion. Perhaps during that time, it would be the native peoples themselves, those who had lived in harmony with this land across generations, who understood the behavior of each species, who knew how to avoid dangerous territory and make use of safer ground, who truly held the key to survival in America, rather than invaders arriving from across the ocean. On the other hand, we should not romanticize this scenario too much either. The presence of enormous, dangerous creatures also meant that native peoples themselves would have faced far harsher survival challenges than they did in actual history. It's possible that, across tens of thousands of years of coexistence, they had developed unique knowledge, strategies, and tools to live alongside, perhaps even partially tame, these creatures, forging a civilization entirely unlike anything else known in human history. This is exactly what makes this hypothesis so compelling. It isn't simply a story about dinosaurs and gunfire, but a doorway into reflecting on how human history might have turned toward something fairer, less bloody, if the raw power of nature had been strong enough to balance out the imbalance of power between invaders and native peoples. Girl, Part 5. The Legacy of a World That Never Was. If we keep pulling this thread of imagination forward into the centuries that follow, the world it creates would be nearly unrecognizable compared to the one we live in today. Without a massive wave of European migration to America during those first centuries, the global demographic map would look completely different. There would be no United States of America born out of 13 British colonies, no American Industrial Revolution driving the global economy the way it once did. Perhaps Asian powers like China, or nations across Africa, would have had far more time and space to develop along their own trajectories, unhampered by the rapid rise of Western powers that had, in real history, been fed in large part by resources and land seized from the New World. Science, as already noted, might have developed along an entirely different path, one where the study of surviving giant creatures became the central force driving biology, medicine, and even the physics of biomechanics needed to understand such massive bodies. Perhaps this world would see scientific breakthroughs arrive far earlier than in actual history in some fields, while lagging behind in others that were, in reality, fueled by wealth accumulated through colonization. And perhaps most importantly of all, America would forever retain a piece of its wild, primeval identity, a constant reminder that no matter how far human technology advances, there remain corners of this planet where nature, in all its raw ferocity, still holds ultimate control. Conclusion: a lesson from a history that never was. This work of fiction, though only a product of imagination, holds within it something far deeper than its entertaining surface suggests. If this hypothesis had truly come to pass, humanity might have been forced to learn a lesson that our actual history never fully taught: that human beings, however proud of their intellect and technology, remain small before the raw power of nature. In our real history, the absence of any natural adversary strong enough allowed humans to carry out conquests with almost nothing to stop them, and the price of that conquest, as we now know, was genocide, the erasure of entire civilizations, historical wounds that still bleed to this day. There is a bitter irony in imagining that, in this fictional timeline, it is the very ferocity of the dinosaurs, creatures humanity has always regarded as symbols of danger and destruction, that inadvertently became a shield, protecting millions of native lives from the most brutal invasions of real history. Sometimes, the harshness of nature itself is the only justice that exists, when nothing else can stand in the way of human greed and power. That is the strange beauty of counterfactual history. It doesn't just show us a future that might have been. It forces us to look back at our real past with a different, more clear-eyed, and perhaps more humble gaze. Because in the end, the real question was never whether dinosaurs could have survived to the year 1492. The real question is, with nothing to stop them, how far would humans go in conquering and exploiting whatever was weaker than themselves? And perhaps, the answer to that question was already written into our real history all along.